who can feel the silk against your skin, but you stopped feeling it as pleasure years ago. Now it only marks the boundary, the place where your body ends and the function begins. The candles are breathing in the darkness around you, their flame moving with your breath, or maybe your breath moving with theirs. You can no longer tell which is controlling which. Before we go deeper into what happened behind those walls, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. It genuinely amazes me that stories this dark, this hidden, can reach across centuries and oceans to find you wherever you are. This is the Palace of Eternal Spring during the Qing Dynasty, though the practices here stretch back through 1,000 years of imperial history. What I'm about to describe isn't folklore or legend. It's documented in medical ledgers, in hidden journals discovered in sealed palace chambers, and testimony from women who survived long enough to whisper their stories to daughters who would never see the inside of those walls. The system had a name, Fang Zhongshu, the bedroom arts, but that gentle phrase concealed something far more brutal, an apparatus of control so elaborate, so scientifically precise, that it transformed women's bodies into instruments for a single impossible purpose: to make an emperor immortal. She was chosen when she was 14. That was 12 years ago, though it feels like either yesterday or several lifetimes stacked on top of each other until they crushed the memory of who she was before. The scouts had come to her village in autumn, after the harvest, and they examined 30 girls with instruments that measured bone spacing, skin translucence and candlelight, the delicate architecture of hands and feet. What they were looking for had a technical name: concentrated essence, what they called hunjing. Small feet were particularly prized. Physicians believed this indicated vital energy that had been bundled rather than dispersed, concentrated into a smaller vessel, making it more potent for transfer. Her father had touched her hair one last time before she was taken. Then she belonged to the palace. The training began immediately in the outer palace, a vast complex of buildings and gardens enclosed within secondary walls, where girls learned what would be required before they ever encountered the emperor. The woman who taught her, Consort Liu, who must have been 60 but moved with the precision of long practice, began with pure theory, Taoist philosophy, the circulation of qi through the 12 meridians of the body, the subtle energy channels connecting every organ in a network. The physicians claimed to understand completely. The belief system was elegant in its logic. A man's essence was concentrated in his lower body, his most vital force contained in what they called Jing. Every time he climaxed, this essence was expelled and lost. Every ejaculation was a bleeding of the life force. The physicians had formulas. They knew exactly how many years a man lost with each release. Women, by contrast, did not lose essence this way. A woman's qi was distributed throughout her body and actually multiplied when she experienced pleasure. It grew stronger, more concentrated. "You exist," Consort Liu said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional certainty, "to receive his desire while preventing its destructive dispersal. You will learn to bring him to the very edge and hold him there indefinitely. The pleasure will increase. The essence will be drawn upward through the meridian channels, and he will become what the philosophers call Zhenren, a perfected being, unchanged, eternal." The theory was completely, utterly, catastrophically wrong about every aspect of human physiology. But it sounded plausible. It incorporated observable elements, the existence of sexual pleasure, the reality that men and women experience sexuality differently, the visible fact of aging. What it lacked was any empirical foundation whatsoever. But empiricism wasn't available to court physicians in the way it would be to science centuries later. They were working with observation and philosophy and centuries of texts that quoted each other endlessly, creating an echo chamber where the same ideas reinforced themselves until no one could remember where they originated or why. And because it seemed plausible, because it benefited the emperor and the officials whose careers depended on managing this system, because it gave them philosophical justification for something they wanted to do anyway: control women's sexuality, manage women's bodies, extract women's capacity for pleasure as a measurable resource. It persisted. It expanded. It deepened across generations. The training itself lasted 8 years for her. Every day the same choreography. She learned techniques that had specific names drawn from nature and mythology. The rising phoenix, the jade dragon entering the cavern, the butterfly ascending the lotus, the 9 shallow and 9 deep. These poetic phrases were actually precise mechanical instructions. She practiced them on jade models carved with extraordinary anatomical detail until her muscles held the patterns like memory, until her body could reproduce them without conscious thought, until they became as automatic as breathing itself. This was intentional. The physicians believed that consciousness interfered with the essence transfer process. If she thought about what she was doing, if she remained aware of herself as a person rather than a function, the energy flow would be disrupted. So they trained her specifically to achieve a dissociative state, where her body moved through prescribed movements while her mind could retreat to some distant place, watching from very far away. But here's what the manuals never acknowledged: that dissociation wasn't just a technique, it was survival. Now, at 26, she has been summoned again. The eunuch appeared at her chamber door this morning, his presence both absence and command, a person who was not quite a person, castrated at 7 years old specifically so he could move through forbidden spaces without desire, without threat, without humanity complicating the machinery of observation. He led her to the bathing chambers where servants washed her in water, heated to precise temperature, infused with herbs believed to enhance her particular essence profile. Substances were applied to her skin, her hair, her genitals, some to increase sensitivity, others to regulate fertility based on calculations she wasn't privy to. The physicians had discovered through decades of systematic experimentation that different herbal preparations could make a woman more or less likely to conceive. A woman designated as a potential mother of heirs received fertility supplements. A woman serving primarily for essence transfer received the opposite: contraceptive mixtures that prevented pregnancy without her knowledge or consent. The bureaucracy of reproduction was as elaborate as everything else. Control extended to the molecular level, to the deepest involuntary functions of the body. She was dressed in red silk, the color representing the movement of qi, the flow of vital energy through channels. The garments were designed to be easily removed and equally designed to display her body in ways that emphasized her value according to the established aesthetic standards. She was, in a very literal sense, wearing her function as text written on her body for the system to read. The walk to the Imperial Chamber followed the same route it always did. The same corridors, the same timing. The same guards stationed at the same intervals. Everything designed to create a sense of inexorable momentum, to make hesitation seem absurd and impossible. She moved through the palace like water flowing downhill, momentum continuing the movement whether she willed it or not. In the chamber, the physicians were already positioned behind lacquered screens, invisible but present. Their observation was fundamental to the entire process. She could feel their attention like weight pressing against her chest. One hand would hold her wrist, counting her pulse against a measured tempo carried in the physician's mind. One hand would hold a bronze mirror angled toward lamplight, moving it across her abdomen in measured arcs, reading what they believed they could see in the subtle reactions of her skin, the dilation of pupils, the flushing of her chest, the pattern of her breathing. One hand would hold a writing brush, and that sound, brush against paper, became the only thing that existed outside her body. Brush, breath, brush, breath. Like the heartbeat of something enormous that contained her completely. The emperor arrived without ceremony. He was 67 but looked older, his face marked by years of the restraint training that was supposed to extend his life, but had instead etched deep lines of concentration into his features. He moved with practiced efficiency, undressing with the ritual precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. His body had the particular quality of something refined and refined until it barely resembled what it once was. He entered her with mechanical purpose. No words, no eye contact. He never looked at any of them directly. Her training took over. Her body knew the sequences without her conscious mind directing them. The milking motions, the controlled contractions, the precise pressure patterns designed to draw out his pleasure while preventing his climax. All of it automatic now, burned into her nervous system through 10,000 repetitions, maybe 15,000. She stopped counting years ago. The cervical secretions are increasing, the physician behind the screen observed, his voice carrying satisfaction. Viscosity is approaching optimal parameters. The tissue response is correct. Blood pooling is appropriate. All conditions aligned for optimal essence transfer. Note this in the permanent record. Optimal. The word meant nothing. It was a placeholder for something that didn't exist. She was a calibration tool. Her body was an instrument being tuned to frequencies that had been determined not by her, but by men who had never experienced what she was experiencing. And then something shifted in her understanding, not in the physical act itself, but in her recognition of the architecture of control. This entire vast apparatus of philosophy and medicine and bureaucracy and surveillance rested entirely on her performance, on the performances of thousands of women like her, selected and trained and positioned and observed for the purpose of maintaining one man's belief in his own potential immortality. The belief couldn't survive scrutiny. The moment anyone asked a simple direct question, does this actually work? Has any emperor using this system lived longer than one who didn't? The entire structure would collapse into dust. But no one asked, because the system was never about empirical truth. It was about power, about taking something that existed outside control, the intimate act, the body's involuntary responses, the complexity of human desire, and subjecting it to total management, about transforming every moment of pleasure into data, every bodily response into a ledger entry, every woman into a file. When the emperor finished, when he reached the limit of his trained control, he withdrew without looking at her. He was already dressing, already moving to the next ritual that defined his day. His attention had shifted elsewhere. He was no longer present, even as his body remained in the chamber. The eunuch entered immediately, materializing as if from the wall itself. He took her wrist and pulled her toward a side chamber where the physician waited with instruments. The examination was invasive in ways that had become so routine she didn't register the intrusion anymore. Fingers inserted to check the exact texture of secretions. A small wooden instrument inserted to measure dilation. Questions asked in a flat voice devoid of emotion. Did he reach conclusion? Did you attain peak response? How many times? Describe the intensity. Did you feel pain? Was the emperor satisfied? She answered with the precision drilled into her through years of conditioning. Complete accuracy was required. Any deviation from truth would be discovered through physical examination, and dishonesty was punished. Increased surveillance, removal from rotation, confinement to the Palace of Tranquility, or removal from the palace entirely. The physician took samples, fluid on specially prepared cloth, particles on prepared slides, and began making notes in a notation system developed over centuries for rapid data recording. All of this information would be entered into imperial ledgers tomorrow. Her number, she hadn't been called by her birth name in 12 years, along with the date, the emperor's designation, detailed physiological response notes, predictions about fertility and essence quality, and an assessment of whether the encounter achieved its stated goal. Everything measured, everything recorded, everything fitted into a system so elaborate, so comprehensively documented, that it had achieved a kind of bureaucratic immortality, even though the emperors it was designed to preserve had all turned to dust centuries ago. The death rate in the harem was significant. Childbirth complications were common. Infections from repeated invasive examinations occurred regularly. Suicide appeared with enough frequency to suggest it was a response to the system rather than an aberration. Some historians have found coded references in surviving journals to poisons that could be obtained from the herbal preparations meant to regulate fertility. Women sometimes knew exactly what would kill them. One account from 1847 mentions a concubine deliberately consuming an excess of a particular herbal mixture, knowing it would cause internal hemorrhaging. The ledgers recorded her death as sudden illness, but a hidden journal suggests it was deliberate. The fact that no investigation occurred suggests the palace understood what had happened and chose not to intervene. That perhaps suicide was an acceptable exit from the system, a release valve that prevented more visible forms of rebellion. The institutional response was not to question the system, but to increase surveillance. Women showing signs of despair were watched more carefully. Some were separated from potential allies. The machine adapted to every form of resistance by intensifying control further. When women tried to escape, the doors were locked. When women tried to kill themselves, they were monitored more closely. When women tried to resist through refusal, they were punished through isolation or forced medication or threats against their families outside the palace. Historians discovered a journal in 1987, hidden in sealed chambers beneath palace ruins. It documents one woman's 20-year journey through the system. She entered at 14. By the time her journal ends, she was approaching 40. The early entries are filled with terror and confusion. Middle entries show resignation and internalization. Late entries are fragmented and incoherent, suggesting complete psychological deterioration. The final entry reads, "I no longer know who I am. I have been broken down so completely that I cannot find myself anymore. I am only what they made me. I am only my function. There is nothing else left." The handwriting is almost illegible, written as though by someone whose mind was no longer fully present. Another woman's journal discovered in 1923 tells a different story. This woman appears to have maintained internal resistance throughout. Her entries contain coded critiques of the system, philosophical arguments that the essence transfer theory cannot be true, observations that emperors using the system do not live any longer than those who do not. The final entries are increasingly angry and accusatory. She writes about discovering medical texts from other regions, suggesting the entire theoretical foundation is false. She writes about confronting one of the physicians with this information. The journal ends abruptly. Historians have found no record of what happened to this woman after that point. The decline of the harem system came gradually over centuries. As scientific knowledge advanced and Western medical understanding became available to Chinese intellectuals, the Taoist theories justifying the system became increasingly indefensible. Yet the system persisted because it had become institutionalized. Generations of officials had built careers managing it. The philosophy had embedded itself in culture. Even as belief in essence transfer theory declined, the practices continued, justified through new frameworks: Confucian duty, imperial necessity, cultural tradition. The core structure remained unchanged, even as the justification transformed completely. By the time the last imperial harem was officially closed in the early 20th century, over 2,000 years of this system's evolution had left marks on Chinese culture and on the women who passed through those walls. Many died inside without ever leaving. Many left only when they aged beyond usefulness. Some escaped. Some were released or given to officials or merchants. But all of them were shaped by the system in ways that echoed through their lives, through their children's lives, through collective memory. The woman in the red silk returned to her chamber after the examination. She washed herself with water. She heated herself, reclaiming one small autonomous act. She lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember her father's face, the sound of her mother's voice, the name she had been called before she became a number in the imperial ledgers. And in the morning, the physicians would review her file and determine whether her performance had been satisfactory, whether the essence transfer had been successful, whether she would be summoned again, or moved to a different rotation, or given different herbal preparations, or elevated or discarded, or simply allowed to continue existing in this terrible equilibrium between function and erasure. The candles kept breathing in the darkness. The silk kept marking the boundary where her body ended and the system began. And somewhere in the archives, a brush moved across paper, recording everything, preserving nothing of who she actually was.